It was almost midnight when we finally started closing up the cafe. The last customer had left about an hour ago, and all that remained was the monotonous hum of the espresso machine being turned off and the scrape of chairs as I stacked them onto the tables. I've always liked working the night shift. Less movement, more peace to think. But that night, something felt different. As I wiped down the counter, I noticed a strange reflection in the large mirror behind the pastry display case. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion or the lights playing tricks on me. But then I saw it clearly. A hooded figure standing near the tables at the back. It was holding something in its arms, something furry and dark. A black cat? Or perhaps a crow, though it was hard to tell from that distance. I froze, trying to figure out how someone could have entered without me noticing. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed through the empty space, sounding weak against the heavy silence. The figure didn't move. I kept staring at the mirror, trying to discern if it was real or just some optical illusion. When I finally decided to approach, it simply disappeared. There were no open doors, no broken windows. It was as if it had never existed. I returned to the counter, trying to convince myself I was just tired and seeing things. But before I could resume cleaning, I heard slow footsteps coming from the area of the tables. I looked again at the mirror, and there it was once more. This time, the figure was closer, its hood slightly fallen to reveal a pale, featureless face. In its arms, the black cat, or crow, now seemed to be staring directly at me through the reflected glass. I wanted to run, scream, do anything to break the surreal moment, but my body felt frozen in place. The hooded figure didn't rush. It was as if it knew I had nowhere to go. Its eyes, or the void where eyes should have been, seemed to pierce through me via the reflection. The black cat in its arms began to stir, arching its back and letting out a faint meow that barely reached my ears but echoed in my mind like thunder. Then, everything happened so fast, I barely had time to process it. The figure tilted its head slightly as if assessing my reaction and vanished again, leaving only the heavy silence of the cafe behind. I slowly came back to reality, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. Maybe it was just fatigue, or maybe I desperately needed a vacation. But when I approached the tables where the figure had been reflected, I found something that made my blood run cold. A single black feather on the floor, faintly shimmering under the dim light. There was no logical explanation for it. I picked up the feather carefully, feeling its unusual texture between my fingers, and tucked it into my pocket, thinking it might be a clue, or something more sinister. That night marked the beginning of a series of strange events that would start transforming my job at Starbucks into something completely different from what I had expected. In the days that followed, things only got stranger. Every night as I closed up the cafe, I found new clues left by the hooded figure. A black feather on the counter, raven talons carefully placed next to the coffee machine, or even a faint scratch on the surface of the mirror forming what looked like a symbol. A circle with crossed lines inside, resembling an ancient mark of protection or warning. Each time this happened, I felt as though I was being watched. The other baristas noticed my unease and began whispering among themselves. "You look a little pale lately," one co-worker said one day as I tried to explain why I was cleaning. The same mirror over and over. She laughed, thinking it was a joke, but when I told her about the hooded figures and the strange reflections, her smile faded. "You shouldn't mess with those things," she murmured before heading back to the register. The feeling of being caught up in something bigger than myself began to weigh heavily on me. One night I decided to research the building where the cafe was located. I discovered that decades ago, the site had been home to an antique shop specializing in mystical objects. They said the owner performed occult rituals there, using black cats and crows as part of his ceremonies. When he mysteriously vanished, the shop was abandoned for years until Starbucks renovated it. But local legends claimed that those creatures never truly left the place, that they still wandered invisible corridors, guarding secrets no one was meant to uncover. Now I wondered if the hooded figure was part of that story, and if I had been chosen for something I couldn't avoid. I decided to return to the cafe at an unusual hour, deep into the night when the building was completely empty and the lights were off. I wanted to understand if there was anything I could do to confront that presence or at the very least learn more about it. As soon as I entered, I felt a different atmosphere. The air seemed denser, as if the space itself were alive. The mirror behind the counter caught my attention again, but this time it didn't just reflect the surroundings. In it, I saw rows of floating candles illuminating hooded figures seated in a circle, with black cats and crows strategically positioned among them. It looked like a ritual frozen in time, as if I were glimpsing something that wasn't supposed to exist in reality. Before I could step away, one of the figures rose and walked toward me, passing through the reflection as if the glass were water. This time it didn't disappear. Instead, it extended a pale, cold hand, handing me a small, rusted key. "Protect the portal," it whispered, its voice echoing as though layered with many others. Before I could ask what it meant, everything returned to normal. The cafe was silent, and the mirror reflected only my frightened face. In my pocket, I found the key the figure had left behind. To this day, I don't know its purpose or what really happened that night, but ever since, I've carried the key with me, fearing that if I lose it, whatever is being guarded might escape. It was a quiet afternoon at Starbucks when a customer walked in and requested something unusual. "A black frost brew, please," she said, as if it were completely normal. I hesitated for a moment, checking the digital menu above the counter. I knew that name wasn't on there. In fact, I'd never heard of that drink in all my years working as a barista. That's not on our current menu," I replied, trying to sound polite. But the customer just smiled as if she knew something I didn't. "Oh, you always have the ingredients. Just make it." Her tone was calm, but there was something unsettling about her expression, as if she were testing my courage. Intrigued, I decided to follow her vague instructions. She mentioned a few items that were still in stock, though they were rare and seldom used. An aged vanilla syrup, beans roasted at midnight, and a touch of hand-ground cinnamon. As I prepared the black frost brew, I felt an odd chill run down my spine, even with the stifling heat of the kitchen. When I handed her the drink, I noticed her fingers were icy cold as they touched the cup. "Enjoy the sensation," she said before leaving behind a heavy silence in the air. A few minutes later, another customer commented on the peculiar aroma lingering in the room. "What is that? It smells ancient," he murmured, looking around as if expecting to see something out of the ordinary. From that day on, the black frost brew began to reappear inexplicably. It wasn't something I or any other barista decided to make. The orders simply appeared, as if the very walls of the cafe were whispering to the customers. Whoever tried the drink always reported something peculiar, an unnatural coldness that lingered even on hot, sunny days. "It's like winter is inside me," one woman said once, rubbing her arms while glancing around uncomfortably. Another customer mentioned feeling a presence behind him, watching him intently, but when he turned around, no one was there. I started noticing strange patterns. Every time the black frost brew was prepared, small changes occurred in the cafe. The mirrors seemed to reflect shadows that didn't exist in the real space. The doorbell rang by itself, and the air grew heavier, as if the room were holding its breath. One night, after closing the shop, I decided to investigate further. I went into the storage area and found a bag of coffee beans that didn't belong to our usual supplier. On the packaging, there was a hand-carved symbol, a circle with crossed lines, similar to ancient marks used in protective rituals. When I touched the bag, I felt an intense cold creep up my hand, as if I were holding dry ice. That's when I heard a soft, almost inaudible voice echoing through the room. "You shouldn't have meddled with this." I quickly pulled back, dropping the bag of beans onto the floor. The sound was muffled, as if the environment had sucked away part of the reality around me. The voice didn't repeat, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I decided to close the storage area and leave as fast as possible, but before I could go, I noticed something even more disturbing. The counter where we prepared drinks was covered with a thin layer of frost despite the perfectly controlled indoor temperature. In the center of the counter, there was an empty cup with traces of the Black Frost brew, the same one I had served hours earlier. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered to myself, trying to find a logical explanation. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this went beyond my understanding. The next day, I asked the other baristas if they had noticed anything strange. Some said yes, others just laughed, thinking I was exaggerating. But one of the older employees pulled me aside and whispered, "Do you know what they say about that drink, right?" I shook my head, not understanding. She explained that years ago, the Black Frost brew was only made for special occasions, or rather during moments when someone needed to make contact. They said the ingredients were blessed or cursed by unknown entities, allowing whoever drank it to feel their presence. "But this isn't just some random legend," she continued, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "If you keep messing with it, you'll attract something you can't send away." I ignored the warning from the more experienced co-worker, thinking it was just superstition. But that night, while cleaning the cafe before closing, I felt an undeniable presence behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know that something or someone was there. The air was so cold that my breath formed visible clouds, even inside the heated space. Slowly, I looked into the mirror behind the counter and saw a hooded figure standing beside me. Its face was invisible under the shadow of the hood, but its pale hands held a cup of Black Frost brew. The drink seemed to glow with its own light, emanating a silvery blue aura that pulsed as if it were alive. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure raised the cup in a silent gesture, as if offering something or demanding something from me. Before I could react, it vanished, leaving only the echo of icy footsteps on the wooden floor. On the counter, I found another empty cup, still covered with a thin layer of frost. Since then, I've learned to avoid any mention of the Black Frost brew. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the cafe during the night shift, I feel that unnatural chill running down my spine and catch out of the corner of my eye, a shadow hovering at the edge of my vision. And I know that presence hasn't left. It's just waiting for the right moment to return. It was almost midnight when I finished the final round of cleaning at the cafe where I worked. The place was completely empty, as it always was after closing time, except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of the wind outside. I was used to the stillness of the night, but that night something felt different. As I finished stacking the chairs on the tables, as we did every day before leaving, I decided to take one last walk around to make sure everything was in order. That's when I noticed it. The tables and chairs were arranged in a strange way, forming a perfect circle in the center of the room. I was certain that this hadn't been done by me or any other employee. I froze in place, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The chairs were arranged with almost supernatural precision, as if invisible hands had meticulously positioned them while I was busy cleaning the counters. There were no footprints on the floor, no signs of recent movement. Just that silent circle, like a mute message left for whoever might see it. For a moment, I thought about undoing the arrangement, but something stopped me. It was as if the air around the circle was heavier, vibrating with an energy I couldn't explain. I quickly decided to leave, locking the door behind me. But as I drove home, I couldn't get that image out of my head. The motionless chairs, perfectly aligned, like part of a ritual I didn't understand. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was just a prank by some bored employee. Maybe someone had decided to arrange the chairs that way for fun, like a kind of temporary art. But when I asked the other baristas, they all denied any involvement. "Why would I do that?" one of them said, laughing, but his laugh sounded nervous, as if he knew more than he was letting on. Another co-worker, older and more experienced, gave me a serious look and muttered, "There are things it's better not to mess with." His response only made me more uneasy. The next night, I decided to stay late to observe what might happen. I hid behind the counter with the lights off, trying to catch any strange movements. For a long time, nothing happened. The cafe remained silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. But then, just before midnight, I heard a soft sound, something like the dragging of wood against the floor, but without the rough noise that usually accompanies such a movement. I peeked over the counter and saw the chairs starting to come down from the tables on their own, as if pulled by invisible hands. They moved slowly, positioning themselves into a perfect circle. Again. This time there was something different. In the center of the circle, a small candle appeared out of nowhere, lit with a blue flame that didn't flicker, even in the still air. That's when I realized this wasn't just a simple prank. It was something much bigger, and I was witnessing something I probably shouldn't have seen. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the scene. The blue flame seemed to pulse softly, like a heart breathing in slow rhythm. As I watched, I felt a strange sensation run through my body, a mix of fascination and fear that rooted me to the spot. Then I heard voices. They weren't loud or clear, but faint whispers, almost inaudible, coming from all directions at once. They seemed to intertwine, forming words I couldn't fully understand, as if spoken in an ancient tongue. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched by something beyond my comprehension. When I finally mustered the courage to stand up and take a step forward, everything froze. The chairs remained motionless in the circle, but the candle in the center began to glow more intensely, illuminating the space with a cold, ethereal light. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. That's when I noticed a shadow emerging at the edge of the circle, an indistinct figure as if made of smoke. It had no defined shape, but its outlines seemed to oscillate between humanoid and something different. Before I could decide what to do, the figure extended an arm toward me, and the temperature in the cafe plummeted drastically. My breath formed dense clouds in the air, and every muscle in my body screamed for me to run. But it was too late. The last thing I saw before bolting out the door was the candle extinguishing itself, leaving behind only darkness and that perfect circle. I ran out of the cafe as if something were chasing me, and maybe it was. When I finally stopped on the sidewalk, gasping for air and trembling from the cold, I realized I'd left the door unlocked. But I didn't have the courage to go back. That night, I dreamed of the circle of chairs and the shadowy figure which now seemed to whisper directly into my ear, "You saw what you shouldn't have." I woke up drenched in cold sweat, the echo of the whispers still reverberating in my mind. The next day, when I arrived at work, everything seemed normal. The chairs were stacked on the tables as usual, and no trace of the previous night's ritual remained. I tried to convince myself it had all been just a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But something changed. Since that night, I've noticed small, unusual details, the sound of chairs dragging late at night even when I'm alone in the cafe, shadows that don't match the position of the lights, and sometimes the faint smell of a recently extinguished candle, though I know no one lights candles inside. Once, I found a circular mark on the floor, as if something had been repeatedly placed there over the years. Now, whenever I see the chairs arranged in a perfect circle, even if it's just in the reflection of a mirror, I know it's more than just furniture moved by wind or coincidence. It's a silent warning that something ancient and powerful is still there, patiently waiting for its next opportunity.